of adversary states, or really any group they wanted, into hacks that were actually conducted by the CIA itself. Basically a tool to create cyber false flags for any purpose. And the current CIA director is the person that was in charge of the Carnegie Endowment when they ran, or when they created these papers with the biggest private banks and central banks in the world about a cyber attack on the financial system, and how that would push for a merging of data sharing between banks and the CIA and intelligence. It's quite clear that the way to force onboarding of a CBDC is going to be some sort of crisis, some sort of event where people will be made an offer they can't refuse, essentially. Whatever that crisis is that creates this situation where people will have, very little choice but to onboard to this new digital currency system, it could manifest in a number of ways, but regardless of how it manifests, what the narrative is going to be is that privacy is dangerous, anonymity is dangerous, specifically financial privacy is dangerous. Those are going to be the narratives that come out of this event, and that's going to be a way to force onboarding both onto digital currency that can be tracked to stop terror financing or things of that nature. And also we have to know who everybody online is, or we have to know who everybody is interacting with these systems. We need digital ID. Well, there's a couple of reasons why I think they'd want to have private banks have like a major role in this digital currency system to come. If there's a private sector entity banking you and managing your money, it's much easier for them to bank you than the federal government. So for example, if the Federal Reserve were to do a direct issue CBDC, it would be harder for them to freeze someone's bank account or debank them in any sort of significant way, as opposed to a private company where you have, for example, precedents where JP Morgan Chase, for example, debanked Dr. Mercola and some of his executives and didn't give any reason as to why. They just said, we can no longer provide you with financial services, no questions asked. That would be very hard to do in the case of a direct issued CBDC. This is something similar to the argument that's been made for social media companies censoring. They say, oh, but they're private companies, so they can restrict speech however they want. But we know now that their restrictions on private speech have been a result of public sector pressure, right? So again, people need to keep in mind that this is a public-private partnership. That's the prevailing model in the United States. The digital dollar in the United States is also going to be a public-private model. You'll have the Fed, the central bank, working with the private banks that own the Fed in the United States. And that will be the partnership between them will be the system. It's not going to be all public. It's not going to be all private. It is a partnership. If the Fed were to do a direct issued CBDC, it would take them a few years to design, experiment, and deploy it. If you're using these existing dollar-pegged stablecoins, those are already here. They're already on blockchains. And a lot of those phases that would take the Fed a few years have already been accomplished if you choose to use those. And if you regulate them so that they have to, for example, keep their reserves at the Fed, then you're able to sort of have the same kind of system, but you don't have to go through the process of creating a direct issued CBDC. So one of the biggest developers right now of CBDCs is this company called R3 that's backed by some of the biggest Wall Street banks in the world. And they were named by Central Banking Magazine as the CBDC Partner of the Year last year. And then they're developing a litany of CBDCs for countries all around the world. But that's just one part of what they do. They have this thing they call a digital currency accelerator. And the three types of digital currencies R3 develops are CBDCs, stable coins, and tokenized deposits or deposit tokens. And some banks in the US have already rolled out deposit tokens. Citigroup, JP Morgan. JP Morgan actually had a research paper out last year about how CBDCs are inferior to deposit tokens and how deposit tokens are better. So Oliver Gale, who defines himself as the founder of CBDCs, has more recently co-founded a company called Fluent Finance. What Fluent Finance is they attempt to create a trustworthy dollar-pegged stablecoin that they call US Plus. And it's sort of framed as an answer to dollar-pegged stablecoins like Tether that have been controversial for having opaque reserves. So the whole thing about US Plus is having trackable reserves in real time and all of this. And so it's an attempt to create a very extremely trustworthy and backed by a consortium of banks, a bank-led US dollar peg stablecoin. So if the inventor of CBDCs is moving into stablecoins, he probably knows that there's something there. Well, if you look at all of this through the lens of risk management, from the elite's perspective, let's take the words of Larry Fink, for example, of BlackRock, who's been obsessed with risk management his whole career. He has a quote, he's on video saying that the markets do not like democracy. Democracy is messy. They like totalitarian governments because the risk is low. Elon Musk is one of these figures that's trying to sort of position himself as a free speech champion, and one of these figures that's on the populist right. But in reality, a lot of the policies that Elon Musk promotes, like carbon taxes, for example, have traditionally been policies promoted like the World Economic Forum and entities like this that are seen as being globalist and not populist in nature. People forget that Elon Musk is someone whose business has depended to a large degree on government subsidies, and currently a lot of his companies either depend on mass adoption of electric vehicles via policies linked to the Sustainable Development Goals to phase out fossil fuel vehicles, or they are contractors for the Pentagon and intelligence, like SpaceX. I think there's essentially a consensus that some other very significant financial crisis is in the cards for the next several years. And if you are the big banks and you know that's going to happen, you probably want to avoid a scenario like what happened in 2008, where the public knew that you were the source of the malfeasance and the economic problems, which of course spawned movements like Occupy Wall Street. If you want to avoid that, what is the best way to absolve yourself of any sort of blame for mismanaging or losing people's money? If you can say that hackers took it, then you're totally absolved, and whoever the hackers are the ones to blame. And U.S. intelligence, or really any intelligence agency today, can frame anyone they want for a cyber attack. We know this from one of the last WikiLeaks releases called Vault 7, where it revealed that among the CIA's hacking tools were the ability to place the fingerprints of adversary states, or really any group they wanted, into hacks that were actually conducted by the CIA itself. Basically a tool to create cyber false flags for any purpose. And the current CIA director is the person that was in charge of the Carnegie Endowment when they created these papers with the biggest private banks and central banks in the world about a cyber attack on the financial system, and how that would push for a merging of data sharing between banks and the CIA and intelligence. So I think one of the reasons they want this new system that ultimately amounts to a control system is because they see it as the ultimate form of risk management. So you surveil them constantly, you can turn their money on and off, you can turn their access to services and really anything else on and off as well under the digital ID functionality. It's a way to keep people in line in a way that didn't exist in, feudal Europe and under that model. But they're clearly moving to that model, and it's interesting because the UN essentially admits that. They talk about the acceleration of the adoption of all these of all this digital infrastructure is exacerbating the wealth gap and making the billionaires even more wealthy. But the billionaires and the bankers are the people that are designing all these UN policies. People, like Mark Carney, Mike Bloomberg, Bill Gates, all of these guys are the ones influencing these policies more than anyone. They admit that they're exacerbating the wealth gap, but we're full steam ahead on these policies anyway. So, they're obviously going to keep exacerbating it. And a lot of those guys that are designing and maintaining the technology or deciding what it does are going to be in a very different class than the rest of us who are, having this system imposed upon us. We're not the ones designing it. We don't have a stake in the stakeholder capitalism model.